I just swore because this is now part four. I'm not going to go back and do it again. I already did that once, and not that I admitted that, but I did. I'm not sure why I'm having such problems with this. My apologies yet again, but this will be the first four-part lecture. I hope it will be the last four-part lecture, and I hope to God this won't be a five-part lecture. Um, anyway, again, my apologies. So this conflict between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads, the military conflict, was became known as the First Civil War, and there wasn't really any solution or outcome. It was kind of a stalemate, etc. And within that context, though, too, another faction within the Roundheads kind of came about, became known as the Levelers. And these were the more radical faction of the Roundheads, supporters of Parliament, but also for the common people. Because the Cavaliers and the Roundheads were basically factions of the Parliament. The Levelers were really advocates for the rights of the people. And I'll be talking about the Levelers and their agreement of the rights, or the agreement of the people of 1647, in a separate slide, in a couple slides further on. But that's kind of the context of which they are developing. That it's not just the nobles that are have issues and problems; it's the common people too. Which then all the tensions and factions and the lack of a clear victory of either side led to renewed outbreak of tensions, particularly under the leadership, the military leadership of a man by the name of Oliver Cromwell. And I'll be talking a separate slide about Cromwell as well. But he's definitely on the levelers or um, Roundhead side. It's kind of ambiguous where he really was at first. He becomes associated with the Puritans. He was basically a Puritan sympathizer, even at first more a little bit closer to the royal position in terms of governmental structure. But then he kind of switches more and more to the Roundhead and leveler position. With the Puritans, we can't just say that the Puritans equals the Roundheads, who equal the levelers. These are various factions. So there's kind of Puritans and all different factions. But there weren't really Puritans in the royal faction, the Cavaliers, who were the Anglican view, because the whole point of the Puritans was to purify the Anglican Church. They're more the Calvinistic side. So that's where they're coming in. And Cromwell was leading the forces. He was seen as actually a very successful and brilliant general. I just got a picture of my dog Ricky again in there. He was in my room as I'm trying to give this lecture. Um, so he really comes to the fore as that we really need to get rid of Charles. He is not only trying to impose this Anglican structure first on Scotland, but then on us. He's also doing so increasingly in cahoots with Spain and with France, Catholic countries. Charles kind of went back and forth. James kind of gone back and forth with in terms of making up with Spain and not and everything, and with France. And so politically, Charles beginning to be seen as not only a threat in terms of this assertion of absolutism, but doing so in a traitorous mean of allying with Spain and France. And his wife was a Catholic, so it's like, what are we to do? We have to get rid of him. And under the leadership of Cromwell and others, the outbreak of the Second Civil War, as it was called, um, led finally to the execution of Charles I, the beheading of Charles I, because they figured that's the only way we can really solve this problem that's been going on now, at least since 1640, if not all the way back to some of the tensions with James I, and the kind of the failure of the Elizabethan settlement. So the military faction of, let's say, the Roundheads slash Levelers, I mean, not the same, one of the same, but the anti-royal faction, the anti-cavalier faction, which was anti-royal because it was anti-Charles, because they were seeing Charles as adhering to Spain and France and against the whole ethos of and exceptionality of the English and the Scottish and the Irish, which was becoming Great Britain. The title is being used here and there. This idea that of England and the empire of England, also with the colonies, is beginning to be set that we are really something. And it began to be seen that the problem is not just with the policy, it's with this assertion of absolute monarchy that James and then Charles were putting forward. So we need to get rid of the monarchy. And to do that, we have to start with getting rid of the monarch, Charles I. So Charles is captured, he's tried for treason, and he is beheaded. So then what? That was kind of the end of the Stuart dynasty. We have James and we have Charles. They established a republic. They established the Commonwealth of England in 1649 after executing Charles, with Cromwell being at the helm, basically, of leading this Commonwealth. Now, you maybe have heard of the British Commonwealth, and it's still there. I mean, Canada is part of the Commonwealth. A lot of the old British Empire, even after gaining independence, is still seen as part of the empire, or part of the Commonwealth, an association of independent states. But the whole point of this was that we are going to govern England, Great Britain, which includes Scotland, Ireland, and our overseas colonies, because it's under James, and James's attempt to kind of suppress some of the Puritan elements that led to the Puritans coming to America in 1609. So that is kind of this whole overarching structure. And the Commonwealth was increasingly being led by Cromwell. It's even been said that he was the one actually to sign the execution order on Charles I. And all the other leaders of the movement against the monarchy were hesitant to do so. Okay, we've captured him. Now what do we do? It's like, let's get rid of him. I don't want to sign his. And Cromwell says, I'll sign it. So that's kind of the situation we're in. Now, where do we go from here? Because there is this third civil war, which follows directly upon the execution of Charles and the establishment of the Commonwealth, and that is with Cromwell's conquering of Ireland, because the Irish were predominantly kind of Catholic. There were some factions that were more Anglican, but Cromwell then says we need to subdue Ireland. We've already kind of sort of done that now a bit with Scotland. We need to subdue Ireland because because Scottish, as I said, was primarily Calvinistic, but Ireland was primarily Catholic. So we need to conquer Ireland. And in the Third Civil War, 1659, 1651, Cromwell is successful in conquering Ireland, and trying to incorporate then Ireland, which is primarily Catholic, into this Commonwealth Presbyterian form of government. So there's going to be tensions, and there have been tensions ever since. You say, well, what about James being King of Ireland? Yeah, but he accepted some of the differences. Here it is this imposition and the military taking over and subduing of, under Cromwell's leadership of the Commonwealth, that then led to the establishment of Cromwell not as king, but as the self-designated Lord Protector of the realm. So that brings me from James 1:6, Charles and the Puritans, to focusing then on Oliver Cromwell, who was very much involved in the entire series of civil wars, more or less, in one faction or another, and coming to the fore as the leader of the Commonwealth. And then in 1653 proclaims himself as Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell. Now, Cromwell I mentioned was a military leader and a very successful one. And he developed what has been called the New Model Army. And this New Model Army then was a standing army. It's really the beginning of the institution of the military. And they were loyal to Cromwell. They followed him, and he recruited levelers, more common people, into the army. So all of a sudden, it's not simply the nobility, it's the English people are being represented in the New Model Army, which then becomes a standing army that is then paid. Very successful fighting force. And that is how then we get to his ability to assert his authority after having conquered Ireland in 1652 to proclaim himself as Lord Protector. And what does he do then? In 1653, he dissolves Parliament. Now, this was the Long Parliament. You may be looking at 1640 to 1660. How could he have dissolved Parliament if Parliament, supposedly the Long Parliament goes until 1660 very easily? We still have these factions involved. And even though he dissolves Parliament, there remained parliamentarians who remained. Became known as the Rump Parliament. So this Rump Parliament is still trying to govern independently of the Lord Protector. And what Cromwell ends up being is a Puritan dictator. There's oppositions. There is resentment. And Oliver Cromwell, even though he had a lot of skill and ability and a lot of success, seen as, anti-monarchical, he was a real nasty piece of work. I mean, that's my personal opinion. But he did more damage to England than he did good. In some ways, it's like you can't really force people to be a certain way. He certainly tried. And lo and behold, it became evident that this Puritan dictatorship was not what the nobility, the parliamentarians in general, not just the Rump Parliament, but the other ones too that had been dismissed and followed along. We have to get rid of them. What we need to do is to restore the monarchy, which they do in 1660. They come back to the monarchy. They bring in Charles II, so that another Stuart monarch, son of Charles I, I believe. I'll have to go back and check on that. I'm not sure. And the Kingdom of England was now once again led by a king with the Restoration in 1660. And Cromwell is over and done with. And even though the rights of the Parliament was very important, I'm missing a slide. I'm looking at, here we go, the agreements for the people. Even though the rights of the Parliament were very important, they still felt that the monarch was needed. This provides, then I'll get to the background to the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Now, in this whole context, before the Restoration, before Cromwell even proclaims himself Lord Protector, I mentioned this earlier. We have the Agreement of the People of 1647. Now, this is rather a radical document, and I thought about assigning it together with the Petition of Right, but I thought, no, I won't. Also, because the formulation is a bit awkward, even kind of when I read this, like, what are they really getting at here? But what it's really arguing is this is a document that was issued by the levelers against the Long Parliament, because it was saying what we needed to do is to include more common people within the Parliament. The Parliament, as the House of Lords and House of Commons, even the House of Commons, weren't all that common. And what we need to do really is have the people represented. They're the rights of the people, libertarianism. Libertarianism today is generally seen as on the radical right wing, limited government, and all those things, individual liberty. It's that, but there's different forms of libertarianism. And what this is arguing for, this agreement of the people, was for a libertarian view whereby individual people should be free to govern the country, not just the nobility or even the gentry, but we should include all factions of society, the levelers. We should level the playing field, so to speak, in terms of government involvement. And that was directly against the Long Parliament, which was more traditionally parliamentarian and arguing for parliamentary rights, the rights of the nobility, going back to the Magna Carta, and then the Petition of Right, 1628, the rights of Parliament over against the monarch. Whereas here, the agreement of the people was to say, yeah, but we have rights too in terms of government. That's where all of this is developing. So that is just part of the background of the context, which then too brings me finally to Thomas Hobbes. Because Thomas Hobbes, in the context of the English Civil Wars, wrote a treatise published in 1651 that was to have huge significance and influence on political theory thereafter. And we'll see how some of that developed as we go along. Now, Hobbes was a scholar. He graduated from Oxford. He had been employed by William Cavendish, one of the major earls and landholders, as a secretary and tutor. So he's teaching, and he's acting as a secretary, almost like a secretary of state for one of the major nobles of England. So he's a royalist, and he's seeing his country being torn apart by civil war. He had written a number of different works, and also in Latin, political works, literary works. He was a classical scholar. He considered himself in that humanist tradition of scholarship looking to Greece and Rome. He was an avid student of Roman history and of the Roman historian Tacitus, who was writing in the end of the first century, also kind of critical of Rome. Tacitus was and had this form of government that was basically almost based on what would become known as realpolitik, which I talked about the politiques, and almost Machiavelli's aspect of how does government function and work? How does it manipulate people to work? And Tacitus has a big study of Augustus. We'll go through all of that, but Caesar Augustus and how Augustus manipulated and managed to construct his rule and authority. That then, within medieval Christendom, kind of fell by the wayside under the concept of divine right and the concept of we are doing God's will, until we get to Machiavelli in the early 16th century, who also is studying classical authors and classical Roman authors, and argues in his book The Prince that it's the success of a prince that's important. Maintaining rule, establishing rule, and maintaining it. Ethics aren't important. Politics is a matter of practicality. It's not a matter of ethics or theology. Always before, theology and politics were one and the same. With Machiavelli, it's more like those are completely separate. And a prince do they have to be moral, good people? Absolutely not. They should be seen as that way. Manipulation. It's a help to their rule if they're not seen as a tyrant. But it doesn't really matter what they do. Now, that's Machiavelli, and Hobbes comes along and he's studying all these things as what is the solution to these tensions. And he sees religious factionalism as being a major problem. How do we handle individuals, like the levelers who are claiming for individual participation in government? How do we handle practicality and authority and what is expedient? How do we keep the country together instead of allowing it to be torn apart in civil war and the execution of a monarch? What do we do about it?